The great hall of the Vathari Empire stretched before him like a cathedral built for giants, and Commander Marcus Cole had never felt so small in his entire life. He was 29 years old, standing alone on a platform of polished black stone, while thousands of alien eyes watched him from the towering galleries. Above, the ceiling disappeared into darkness so high that clouds seemed to drift between the golden pillars. And Marcus wondered if this was how an ant felt when it wandered into a human palace. He represented Earth today, the only human in a room filled with the most powerful beings in the known. Galaxy 47 different species had sent their ambassadors to witness this moment, and every single one of them was looking at the small human in the gray uniform who dared to ask for a seat among the stars. Vathari had ruled this sector of space for 12,000 years, and their architecture reflected their arrogance. In every massive column and every impossibly high archway, they were reptilian creatures who stood nearly 3 meters tall, with scales that shimmered like liquid metal and eyes that glowed with ancient intelligence. Their empire had conquered 100 worlds before humanity had learned to make fire, and they wanted everyone to remember that fact. Marcus kept his spine straight and his hands steady at his sides, even though his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Had achieved faster than light travel only 5 years ago, and now they were asking for recognition as a spacefaring civilization. It should have been a simple ceremony, a formal acknowledgement that humanity had joined the cosmic community. But Marcus had seen the way the Vathari looked at humans during the preliminary meetings, and he had felt something cold settle in his stomach. They did not see humans as equals or even as potential allies. They saw them as insects who had somehow learned to build rockets. Crown Prince Sirkaith descended from his throne on a platform that floated without any visible support, and the crowd fell silent with a reverence that bordered on worship. He was young for a Vathari, only 400 years old, but his scales were the deep purple of royalty, and his eyes burned with the pride of a creature who had never known defeat. The prince carried something in his clawed hand, and Marcus squinted to see what it was. His blood went cold when he recognized the shape. It was a stone hand axe, a replica of the primitive tools that human ancestors had used millions of years. Ago Sirikoth held it up for the crowd to see, and a ripple of amusement passed through the galleries. Behold the great achievement of humanity, the prince announced, his voice echoing through the hall like thunder rolling across mountains. They have crawled from the mud of their little world mere heartbeats ago, and already they asked to stand among civilizations that were ancient when their son was young. Marcus felt the words strike him like physical blows, but he did not flinch, and he did not look away. The prince floated closer until he was hovering directly above the human, looking down with contempt that had been refined over centuries of practice. I have studied your species, Sirkaith continued, and his tone suggested that he had studied them the way a scientist might study bacteria under a microscope. You live for less than a century if disease or violence does not claim you first, and you spend most of that brief time fighting among yourselves over patches of dirt and imaginary lines on maps. Laughter echoed from the galleries, and Marcus heard the clicking sounds that passed for amusement among the insectoid Kethmari, and the deep rumbling chuckles of the stone-like Orvanivarion was laughing at humanity. At Earth, at him. Kneel, the prince commanded suddenly, and his voice had lost all pretense of ceremony. Marcus did not move for a long moment, and silence fell over the hall like a heavy blanket. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting to see what the primitive human would do. He thought about refusing, about standing tall and demanding the respect that Earth deserved, but he also thought about the Vathari battle fleets that could reduce Earth to ash in a matter of hours. And he thought about the billions of humans who were counting on him to bring them into the galactic communities. So Marcus Cole knelt on the cold black stone, and he hated himself for it. Even as his knees touched the floor, Prince Sirkaith smiled, with a mouthful of teeth that could tear through steel, and he produced a golden cup filled with ceremonial wine. Let me bless this creature before we send it back to the mud where it belongs," the prince declared. And then he poured the wine over Marcus's head. The liquid was cold, and it smelled like nothing Marcus had ever encountered before. Sweet and bitter at the same time, it dripped down his face and soaked into his uniform, while the great hall erupted in laughter that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Marcus felt the wine running into his eyes and his mouth, and he tasted humiliation more bitter than any drink. But he did not cry out, and he did not curse, and he did not beg. Instead, he looked up at Prince Sirkavth with calm dark eyes, and he smiled. It was not a smile of submission or defeat or even anger. It was the smile of a man who had just made a decision that would change the course of history. Though no one in that hall understood what they were witnessing, the prince's laughter faltered for just a moment when he saw that smile, and something flickered in his ancient eyes that might have been confusion or perhaps the faintest shadow of unease. "Earth's petition for recognition is denied," Sirkavth announced, turning away from the kneeling human as if Marcus had already ceased to exist. "Let them return when they have learned their place in the universe, if their species survives long enough to learn anything at all." Marcus rose to his feet slowly, wine still dripping from his hair and his uniform ruined beyond repair. He walked out of the great hall with his head held high, passing through corridors filled with aliens who pointed and laughed and made jokes in languages he could not understand. Footage of his humiliation was broadcast across human space within hours, and billions of people watched their representative kneel and be doused with wine like a dog being punished for begging at the table. Some called for war, screaming that humanity should build weapons and return to burn the Vitari Empire to the ground. Others fell into despair, wondering if humans were truly as primitive and worthless as the aliens believed. But Marcus Cole said nothing to the reporters who swarmed him when he returned to Earth. And he said nothing to the politicians who demanded explanations and apologies. He resigned his commission quietly, packed his few belongings, and disappeared from public life as completely as if he had never existed. The galaxy quickly forgot about the human who had been humiliated at the Grand Conclave, and Prince Sirkavth certainly never thought about the incident again. Why would he waste precious thoughts on an insect he had already crushed beneath his heel? But humanity did not forget, and Marcus Cole did not forget, and somewhere in the quiet corners of Earth, a plan began to take shape that would not bear fruit for nearly 3 decades. The prince had poured wine on a single human and laughed at his silence. He did not understand that some silences are not empty spaces, but rather the gathering of storms, the patient accumulation of pressure that will one day crack mountains and reshape worlds. Marcus Cole's silence had begun, and it would echo through the galaxy for 27 years before anyone understood what it truly meant. 15 years passed like water flowing through cracks in stone, slow and steady and impossible to stop. Galaxy moved on, and empires rose and fell, and new stars were discovered while old ones died. But humanity remembered what had happened in the Great Hall of the Vaitharad. They called it the Kneeling, and parents told their children about it as a warning and as a promise, a warning that the universe was cruel to those who were weak, and a promise that one day Earth would rise to claim its rightful place among the stars. Marcus Cole had vanished from public life, but he had not vanished from the world. He had simply learned to work in shadows where no one thought to look for him. 3 months after his return from the Vithari Empire, he used the fortune his late father had left him to purchase an old research facility on the coast of what used to be called California. He registered a company called the Prometheus Institute and filed papers claiming that it would study theoretical xenoeconomics. Whatever that meant, government officials glanced at the paperwork and shrugged and filed it away in dusty cabinets, where it would never be examined again. That was exactly what Marcus wanted. The Prometheus Institute did not study economics at all. Theoretical or otherwise, it studied everything that the Vathari believed humans were too primitive to understand. Marcus spent the first year recruiting, and he did not look for the scientists who had won awards or the engineers who worked for prestigious companies. Looked for the ones who had been rejected and mocked and pushed aside because their ideas were too strange or too ambitious. He found a physicist named Dr. Sarah Chun, who had been laughed out of 3 universities for claiming she could extract energy from the vacuum of space itself. He found an engineer named Victor Okonkwo who had been fired from every job he ever held because he refused to accept that faster-than-light travel had reached its limits. He found strategists and programmers and chemists and biologists, all of them brilliant and all of them broken by a system that did not know what to do with minds that thought too far ahead. Marcus gave them funding and freedom, and a single directive that he repeated at every meeting: make us indispensable, he told them. And his eyes held the same calm darkness they had shown when wine dripped down his face in the Vathari Great Hall. Make us so valuable that the galaxy cannot ignore us, and make us so advanced that they cannot threaten us. The scientists worked in secret for years, hidden behind layers of shell companies and false fronts that would make any investigator dizzy trying to untangle them. Dr. Chun cracked the secret of zero-point energy extraction in year 4, and suddenly the Institute had access to unlimited power that cost nothing to generate. Victor Okonkwo completed his resonance drive in year 7, and test flights proved that it was 3 times faster than any faster-than-light system in the known galaxy. Other breakthroughs followed like dominoes falling in slow-motion. Quantum lattice computing that made previous human technology look like children playing with wooden blocks. Medical treatments that could extend human lifespans by decades without any of the side effects that plagued earlier attempts. Material science that produced alloys stronger than anything the Vathari had ever created. But Marcus did not announce these achievements to the world, and he did not sell them to the highest bidder. He gathered them like a dragon gathering gold, piling treasure upon treasure in the darkness where no one could see. When his scientists asked why they were not sharing their discoveries, Marcus simply smiled that same unsettling smile and told them to be patient. The Vathari have ruled for 12,000 years, he reminded them, and they think in centuries the way we think in weeks. So if we want to defeat them, we must learn to think in decades the way they think in days. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Prince Sirkaith became Emperor Sirkaith when his father died suddenly in year 12. Some whispered that the death was not as natural as the official reports claimed, but no one dared to investigate too closely. The new emperor's first decree was to increase tribute demands from all vassal worlds by 40%, claiming that the empire needed more resources to maintain its glorious military. The vassal races grumbled and complained, but they paid because they had no choice and because they feared the Vathari battle fleets that hung in orbit above their homeworlds like executioners waiting for the signal to drop their axes. The Kethmari were insectoid creatures who had been conquered 3,000 years ago, and they survived by farming and keeping their heads down and hoping the Vathori would not notice them. The Vavani were beings of living silicon who processed information faster than any organic mind. But their planet had been stripped of resources and they were kept deliberately poor and dependent. The Lani were amphibious people whose world was 90% water, and a plague had been spreading through their populations for centuries, while the Vathari refused to allocate medical resources to help them all. Of these species and dozens more lived under the boot of the Empire, and they had learned to accept their suffering as the natural order of things. They did not know that a human named Marcus Cole was watching them from across the stars, cataloging their grievances and studying their cultures and Learning what each of them needed most, he built a Deod's network of informants, so subtle that not even the Vathari intelligence services suspected its existence. A merchant here, a diplomat there, a servant in a noble household who was willing to share secrets for a price that Marcus always paid promptly and generously. Information flowed back to Earth like rivers feeding an ocean, and Marcus stored every detail in databases that only he could access. He learned that Emperor Sircath had a temper that grew worse with age, and that he had already executed 3 advisors for bringing him news he did not want to hear. He learned that the Vathari military was massive but outdated, relying on technologies that had not been updated in centuries because the Empire saw no need to improve what already dominated every species they encountered. He learned that corruption had spread through the noble houses like rot through fruit, and that loyalty to the Emperor was becoming more performance than genuine devotion. And he learned that somewhere deep in classified archives, there were records of experiments the Vathari had conducted on vassal populations. Experiments so terrible that even the coldest nobles preferred not to speak of them. Marcus filed this information away with everything else, adding it to the weapon he was building one piece at a time. His hair turned gray at the temples, and lines appeared around his eyes. But his patience never wavered, and his silence never broke. Reporters occasionally tried to find him, wanting to ask about the kneeling on its anniversary or seeking comment on some new development in human Vathari relations. They never succeeded because Marcus had become a ghost, present everywhere and visible nowhere. The prince who had humiliated him was now an emperor who ruled 1,000 worlds. And Marcus was just a forgotten human who ran a small research company that no one had ever heard of. But appearances can be deceiving, and the smallest streams can carve the deepest canyons if they flow long enough. 15 years after the wine had dripped down his face, Marcus Cole looked at what he had built and decided that the foundation was finally complete. Now it was time to start building the walls. In the 16th year after the kneeling, a new trading company appeared on the edges of Vathari space, and no one paid much attention to it at first. The Cole Consortium was small and human-run, which meant that most alien merchants dismissed it as a temporary curiosity that would collapse within a few seasons. They were very wrong. Marcus Cole had spent 15 years preparing in the shadows, but now he stepped into the light wearing the mask of a simple businessman who wanted nothing more than to make honest profits through fair trade. He hired ships and crews from 12 different species, and he established trading posts on neutral stations where the laws of the Vathari Empire did not reach. His prices were fair, his deliveries were reliable, and his contracts were honored to the letter, even when circumstances made it costly to do so. Word spread quickly among merchants and traders that the human company could be trusted, and trust was a rare commodity in a galaxy ruled by an empire that changed laws whenever it suited the emperor's mood. Within 3 years, the Cole Consortium had become the largest independent trading company in the sector, with branches on 40 worlds and a fleet of cargo ships that moved constantly between the stars. But trade was only the surface of what Marcus was building. Every route his ships traveled was mapped and analyzed. Every world they visited was studied, and every contact they made was carefully evaluated for potential usefulness. The consortium became his eyes and ears throughout Vathari space, a legitimate business that provided perfect cover for gathering the information he needed. In year 18, Marcus made his first move against the Empire's foundations. He traveled to the homeworld of the Kathmari, those insectoid farmers who had lived under Vathari rule for 3,000 years. There, crops were failing because their soil had been depleted by centuries of excessive harvesting demanded by imperial tribute collectors, and famine was spreading through their colonies. Marcus brought them seeds engineered by the Prometheus Institute, seeds that would grow in exhausted soil and produce 3 times the yield of their traditional crops, a gift from humanity, he told the Kethmari Council. And when they asked what he wanted in return, he simply smiled and said nothing. Council members looked at each other with compound eyes that had seen too many tricks and betrayals. But they accepted the seeds because their people were starving and they had no other options. The seeds worked exactly as promised. And within 2 growing seasons, the Kethmari had more food than they had produced in decades. Word of this miracle spread to other vassal races, carried by merchants and travelers who whispered about the strange humans who gave away advanced technology for free in year 20. Marcus visited the Orvani homeworld, where the silicon-based beings struggled with computing systems that had been deliberately limited by Vathari restrictions. He brought them quantum processors that made their old systems look like toys. And once again, he asked for nothing in return. The Orvani leaders were suspicious because no one in their long history had ever given them something without demanding payment. Usually payment that cost more than the gift was worth. Why do you help us? They asked through their crystalline communication devices. And Marcus gave them the same answer he had given the Kethmari. Humanity remembers what it is to be overlooked and underestimated. So consider this a gesture of friendship between species who understand suffering. The Orvani did not fully believe him, but they used the technology anyway, and their civilization began to flourish in ways the Vathari had never intended to allow. Year 22 brought Marcus to the water world of the Delany, where the amphibious people were dying from a plague that had killed millions over the centuries. The Vathari had the medical knowledge to cure the disease, but they had never bothered to share it because the Delany were useful enough, even with reduced populations. Marcus brought them treatments developed by the Prometheus Institute, medicine so effective that the plague was eliminated within 18 months. The Delany wept when they realized their children would no longer die gasping and suffering. And they carved Marcus Cole's name into sacred stones that would stand for 10,000 years. Terran Friend, they called him. And soon other vassal races began using the same word. It spread through the sector like a song that everyone wanted to learn. A new idea that the galaxy had not heard before, the idea that humanity might be worth knowing, worth respecting, worth trusting. Emperor Sirkavth heard reports about the human merchant who was giving away technology to vassal races, and his advisors recommended investigating the matter more closely. But the emperor was busy with court intrigues and military parades and the endless business of maintaining absolute power over 1,000 worlds. Let the ape play at commerce, he declared, his voice dripping with the same contempt he had shown 22 years ago in the Great Hall. It keeps them distracted from their inadequacy. And perhaps the vassals will be more productive if they have new toys to play with. His advisors bowed and agreed, because agreeing with the emperor was the only safe choice. And no one investigated the Cole Consortium any further. Marcus heard about the emperor's dismissal through his network of informants, and he allowed himself a small smile that no one else would ever see. The web was taking shape. Thousands of invisible threads, connecting worlds and species and individuals who did not even know they were being woven together. Each gift Marcus gave created loyalty that no amount of imperial force could match. Each friendship he forged planted seeds that would grow into something the Vathari could not cut down. And through it all, he never spoke publicly about the kneeling, never complained about the humiliation he had suffered, never gave any sign that he remembered what Prince Sirkavth had done to him. Reporters and diplomats and even Vathari intelligence agents tried to get him to talk about it, curious about how the famous humiliated human had transformed himself into a successful merchant. Marcus always declined with polite words that revealed nothing, and his silence became legendary among those who studied human behavior. Some said he had forgiven the emperor and moved on with his life. Some said he was too afraid to speak out. against the most powerful being in the sector. A few wise observers suspected that his silence meant something else entirely, but even they could not guess the full truth. The truth was that Marcus Cole had learned the most important lesson. The Vathri could have taught him power does not always roar and threaten and destroy. Sometimes power waits in silence, gathering strength, weaving connections, building something so vast and so patient that by the time anyone notices it, the outcome is already decided. By year 24, the web was nearly complete, and Marcus began preparing for the final stage of his plan. Emperor still sat on his throne, surrounded by luxury and flattery. Confident that his empire would last another 12,000 years, he did not notice that the ground beneath him had become hollow, that the foundations were crumbling, that a human he had forgotten long ago was about to remind him why you should never underestimate a species that learned to build civilizations from mud and stone and dreams. In the 25th year after the kneeling, the Vatari Empire faced a crisis that no one had predicted, and no one knew how to solve. A blight appeared on the agricultural worlds that fed the imperial military, spreading through crops with terrifying speed and leaving nothing but withered stalks and poisoned soil in its wake. Scientists could not determine where the blight had come from or how to stop it, and within 6 months, half the food production of the core worlds had collapsed. For the first time in recorded history, the Thuricitans knew what it felt like to be hungry. Emperor Sirkavth raged in his palace, executing advisors who brought him bad news and demanding solutions from scientists who had none to give. His only answer was to increase tribute demands from the vassal worlds, ordering them to send more food to make up for what the blight had destroyed. But something strange happened when the imperial collectors arrived to enforce the new demands. 12 worlds refused at exactly the same time, their governments declaring that they could not and would not send additional tribute while their own people needed feeding. No one had ever refused the emperor before, and Sirkavth could not believe what he was hearing. "Send the fleet," he commanded, his scales flushing dark with fury. "Burn their cities until they remember who rules this sector of space." Warships jumped to the rebellious worlds, their weapons charged and their commanders ready to demonstrate the price of defiance. But when they arrived, they found something unexpected waiting for them. Defense systems they had never seen before, shields that absorbed plasma fire like water absorbing heat, targeting computers that predicted Vathri tactics with impossible accuracy. The battle lasted less than an hour, and when it was over, 3 imperial warships were drifting wreckage while the rest fled back to Vathri space with damage that would take months to repair. The technology that had defeated them was human in origin, given freely to the vassal worlds by the Cole Consortium over the past decade. Emperor Sirkavth received this news while sitting on his throne, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Then he spoke a name he had not thought about in over 2 decades, Marcus Cole. He whispered, and the words tasted like poison in his mouth. The Emperor summoned the Cole Consortium for negotiations on his personal flagship, sending a message that was formal on the surface, but contained threats that any careful reader could detect. Marcus accepted the invitation without hesitation, traveling alone to the massive warship that hung in orbit above the Vathri homeworld. Guards escorted him through corridors of polished metal and ancient stone, past murals depicting 12,000 years of imperial conquest, until he reached the throne room where Sirkavth waited. The emperor had aged in 27 years, his scales losing some of their luster and his movements becoming slower and more deliberate, but his eyes still burned with the same pride that had led him to pour wine over a kneeling human in the great hall of his ancestors. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, little human," Sirkavth said, and his voice echoed through the chamber like distant thunder. Marcus stood before the throne, wearing a simple gray suit with his hands clasped behind his back, and he did not bow or kneel or show any sign of the fear that the emperor expected. "I am a merchant, Your Majesty," he replied calmly. I sell goods and provide services to customers who value quality and fair dealing. And if some of those customers happen to be vassal worlds that your empire has neglected, that is simply good business. The emperor leaned forward on his throne, his claws digging into the armrests with enough force to leave gouges in the ancient metal. Do not play games with me, he growled. I know what you have been doing for the past decade, building alliances and spreading your human technology like a plague through my empire. And I want to know why. Marcus smiled then, the same smile he had shown when wine was dripping down his face 27 years ago. You called us short-lived, Your Majesty, but here I stand while your father's ashes have long grown cold, and you said we crawled from mud, but perhaps we learned to build from it. He reached into his jacket and produced a single datapad, holding it up for the emperor to see. This device contains evidence of war crimes committed by the Vitari Empire over the past 3,000 years, including the massacre of civilian populations, the deliberate spread of diseases among vassal species, and secret biological experiments conducted on prisoners without their consent. Sir Kaif's eyes widened, and for the first time something like fear flickered across his ancient face. My informants gathered this evidence over 27 years. Marcus continued, and 12 hours ago copies were delivered to every member of the Galactic Council along with requests for formal investigation. You lie, the Emperor shouted, rising from his throne with a speed that betrayed his earlier slowness. No human could have built such a network without my intelligence services detecting it. Your intelligence services detected exactly what I wanted them to detect, Marcus replied, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. They saw a small human trading company, run by a man who had been publicly humiliated and who posed no threat to the mighty Vathari Empire, and they never looked deeper because you taught them to believe that humans are primitive creatures barely worth noticing. Sir Kaif lunged toward Marcus with claws extended, rage overcoming whatever remained of his imperial dignity. But guards stepped between them before the Emperor could reach his target, and Marcus noticed that the guards were Kethmari rather than Vathari hired. Through the consortium loyal to humanity, your empire is already falling, Marcus said quietly as the guards held back the struggling Emperor. The vassal races have seen that they can resist you and survive. The Galactic Council is preparing sanctions that will cripple your economy, and your own noble houses are whispering that perhaps it is time for new leadership. He stepped closer until he was looking directly into those ancient burning eyes. I did not come here to destroy you, Your Majesty, because destruction would only create chaos that would harm the innocent species you have oppressed for so long. Then what do you want? Sir Kaif demanded, his voice cracking with fury and something that might have been desperation. I want you to remember this moment. Marcus answered, I want you to remember that a species you dismissed as primitive and short-lived just brought your 12,000-year empire to its knees without firing a single shot. And I want you to spend whatever years remain to you wondering what else we might be capable of. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving the Emperor standing helpless among guards, who no longer answered to him. I waited 27 years for this conversation, Marcus said without looking back, and I have decided that your silence will be longer than mine. The Vathari Empire did not collapse in fire and blood as so many empires had done before it. Instead, it transformed like a snake shedding its skin, leaving behind the old and dead and emerging as something new and uncertain. The evidence that Marcus Cole had gathered over 27 years spread through the galaxy like light spreading from a newly born star, illuminating crimes that had been hidden for millennia. The Galactic Council condemned the Empire unanimously, imposing sanctions that would have crippled the Vathari economy, even without the ongoing agricultural crisis. More importantly, the vassal races finally understood that they were not alone and that resistance was possible. Rebellions erupted on 100 worlds. Not violent uprisings that could be crushed by warships, But quiet revolutions of refusal and non-cooperation workers stopped working. Merchants stopped trading, and the machinery of empire ground to a halt because you cannot rule a galaxy when no one will obey your commands. The noble houses of the Vaetheri gathered in secret councils to discuss what could be done. And they reached the conclusion that many had been afraid to speak aloud for decades. Emperor Sir Caith had to go. They moved against him on a night when 3 moons hung full above the imperial palace, stripping him of his titles and his power and his dignity. In a ceremony that lasted less than an hour, he was exiled to a barren moon on the edge of Vaetheri space, a frozen rock where nothing grew and no one visited, and he was told that he would spend the rest of his very long life contemplating the consequences of his arrogance. The new government that emerged was a constitutional council where power was shared among the noble houses rather than concentrated in a single ruler. They sent formal apologies to every vassal world, acknowledging the crimes of the past and promising reforms that would take generations to complete. And they invited humanity to join the galactic community as a full and equal member, a recognition that would have seemed impossible 27 years ago when a young commander knelt in the Great Hall while wine dripped from his hair. The ceremony was held on Earth, in a building constructed specifically for this moment, and representatives from 60 spacefaring civilizations gathered to witness humanity take its place among the stars. Marcus Cole was asked to represent his species at the ceremony, to stand where he had once knelt and accept the recognition that had been so cruelly denied. He refused instead. He recommended a young diplomat named Commander Alia Chun, who was 29 years old, the same age Marcus had been when he faced Prince Sir Caith in that distant hall. She accepted Earth's recognition with grace and wisdom, speaking of peace and cooperation and the hope that all species could learn from the mistakes of the past. Her words were broadcast across human space and beyond, reaching billions of beings who watched this new chapter in galactic history begin. But Marcus did not watch the ceremony. Stood in his garden on the California coast as the sun rose over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded him of Vatar scales. He was 56 years old now, his hair more gray than brown, and his face marked by lines that told the story of decades spent building something that no one else could see. A journalist had finally tracked him down after years of searching, a persistent woman who had made it a mission to interview the man behind the Cole Consortium. She found him watering flowers as if it were any ordinary morning, as if the galaxy had not just changed forever because of plans he had set in motion when she was still a child. "Commander Cole," she asked, using the title he had abandoned long ago, "after everything you have accomplished, after the planning and the patience and the victory, do you have anything to say?" Marcus considered the question for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where sky met sea. He thought about the wine dripping down his face and the laughter echoing through the great hall. He thought about the 15 years of building in shadows, gathering brilliant minds who had been rejected by everyone else. He thought about the web he had woven across 1,000 worlds, the gifts given freely that had planted seeds of loyalty no empire could uproot. Thought about standing before Sir Caith on his own flagship, watching fear replace arrogance in those ancient burning eyes, and he thought about the young commander who was accepting humanity's recognition at this very moment, representing a species that had proven itself worthy without ever needing to fire a weapon in anger. And he smiled, the same calm smile that had unsettled a prince and haunted an emperor. "Humanity speaks through what it builds," he said quietly. "I simply gave us time to find our voice." He turned and walked back toward his house, and the journalist understood that the interview was over before it had really begun. His silence at last was complete, but the story did not end there. On the barren moon of his exile, surrounded by ice and stone and the howling of winds that never stopped, former Emperor Sir Caith received a package. It arrived by automated drone, traveling across light years of empty space to reach this forgotten corner of the galaxy, where a fallen ruler spent his days staring at the stars and remembering when he had commanded them. The package was small and wrapped in plain brown material. With no return address and no message added, Ched Seravath opened it with trembling claws. His heart's racing with something that might have been hope or fear or both inside. Resting on a bed of soft fabric was a single object that he recognized immediately, a stone hand axe. Carved from earth granite with obvious care and skill, it was the same type of primitive tool he had waved before the laughing crowd 27 years ago. The symbol he had used to mock humanity's short history and humble origins. There was no note, because no note was needed. The message was perfectly clear. You called us primitive, but we outlasted your empire. You called us short-lived, but we will remember this moment when your name has been forgotten. You poured wine on our representative and laughed at his silence. Now you will spend eternity in silence while the galaxy tells stories of what humanity achieved. Zeravath held the hand axe for a very long time, feeling the weight of the stone and the smoothness of its edges. Then he began to laugh. A bitter sound that echoed off the frozen walls of his prison. It was the laugh of someone who finally understood a joke that had been playing out for nearly 3 decades. And the punchline was him far across the galaxy. Marcus Cole put down his gardening tools and went inside to make breakfast. Did not know about the package that had been delivered to the exile moon, arranged years ago through intermediaries who had never met him and would never know his name. He did not need to know. Some echoes carry themselves once they are set in motion, traveling through space and time until they reach the ears that need to hear them. The prince had laughed at a kneeling human. Now the human was gardening in the morning sun, while the prince rotted in exile, holding a stone tool and finally understanding what it meant to be humbled. The echo had answered, and humanity had found its voice at last.